So welcome everybody to another PlantLab Conversation, and a very warm welcome to Dr. Angelo Vermeulen, who is our guest today. I want to start, as I normally do, with just saying thanks to the spirits and ancestors of Te Tai Tokoro and the land itself, which has brought us here together, and may our work be of benefit to those here, those who join us, and the planet in general. So thank you everybody for coming along. PlantLab, for those of you who are just joining us, is a transdisciplinary project. We're very kindly funded by the Ministry of Culture and Heritage in New Zealand, and we are also, for the recordings we're making, supported by Zoom, who are sponsoring the recording process. I want to just do a shout out to all of those who are involved. So you're going to see a lot of faces on the screen at the moment. These are participants in the PlantLab alongside Dr. Vermeulen, who's talking today. And we are having kind of a conversation about Angelo, if that's all right if I call you Angelo, because that's how I know you. Angelo's
of course,
work, yeah. And then some questions from people who are working in PlantLab, which is essentially an installation / innovation pop-up research hub, which will be physically located in Whangarei, Te Tai Tokoro in August, September, October, and has a number of online components that build up to that particular event. So to start, Angelo, I know you from, I think I worked it out 60 years ago when we first met in Brussels, when we were working for Foam Brussels, or we were both doing residencies or part of the mix of Foam Brussels, which is kind of an eclectic, another transdisciplinary group. And we met when you were, I think, in the process or beginning the process of doing Biomod, one of your first projects, or working in and amongst that area. For those of you who don't know Angelo, I'm sure there's very few. Angelo is a space researcher, a biologist, and an artist. I guess undefinable in terms of many times working across all those spheres at once. And also the founder of SEAD, or SEED, I call it SEAD.
Seeds.
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 Which is an international transdisciplinary network that fosters collaboration for work that, I guess, essentially supports the planet in summary. A very interesting group, but I guess you may say a little bit more about that later. Angela, you're here to talk a little bit about yourself, about transdisciplinary practice, and I guess answer some questions, or maybe you might even have some questions yourself back to the people who are working as part of our PlantLab transdisciplinary node. So perhaps if we start with you saying a little bit more about yourself after my hopefully intriguing beginning.
Yeah, I made a presentation specifically for this with some visuals. I basically made a selection of a couple of projects that I think might be of interest to you for the PlantLab. So, and I will talk about Biomod because that's I think a project that is very relevant here. Let me start by sharing my screen and then see how that goes. Just a sec. All right. Can you see my full slide? All right. So what you see here is actually how I started out. I am a trained biologist, an ecologist and developmental biologist, and this is the topic I was working on, or the organism I was specialized in. It's called a chironomid larvae. It's a non-biting midge, and I was working on the teeth of these larvae. I've been investigating thousands of teeth of this particular organism living in the sediments of streams and rivers. And the interesting thing is that this organism is usually, this insect is usually one of the, I mean, it's the larva of a midge. It is an insect. That these larvae are usually among the last organisms that survive in stressed environments, contaminated environments. And that is because they have hemoglobin in their blood. And so when the oxygen levels drop significantly in a water body, they can last the longest. Now, the thing is that one of the impacts of toxic contamination on these organisms is that their teeth deform. And so you can actually use the deformities of the teeth as bioindicators of environmental pollution. And so that's what I was trying to work on for a number of years. I did a whole PhD on this. But as you can already sense, this is a very small, particular view on the world, of course. And I was in my early 20s, and I was like, I'm not sure this is going to be the rest of my life. I mean, scientists build careers out of these very, very tiny niche topics that they find, and they become an expert in it. I mean, people were coming from different parts of the world to my lab to learn how to investigate and recognize and identify these deformities, but still I was like, this is probably too small. So I moved on, and I've always been interested in the arts, and I would assume that within this group there is also this interest in transdisciplinary thinking, where multiple interests are being brought together. And I've always had this interest in the arts. And basically, during this research, I was also enrolled in an art school. I was studying photography. And that's where my passion for the arts started growing. And by the end of it all, I basically decided to become an artist. I was like, science is interesting, but, it's probably not going to be my life. I want to be an artist. And very quickly, in trying to find my voice in the arts, I picked up biology, and that became a component of my art. And I think that's one of the reasons that I'm here today with you. And one of the projects that I've been working on the longest probably is the Biomod project that Maggie already mentioned. And Biomod is really an art project, a community art project, in which we kind of, through a co-creation process, question how we imagine relationships between nature and technology. It's really that tension between nature and technology that is explored. And we're trying to build kind of unusual and different relationships between nature and technology. That's really at the heart of it. What you can see here is one of the latest iterations of the project that was done last year. It's a quite monumental art installation that was built in a medieval building in the city of Bruges, in the historical city of Bruges in Belgium, really contrasting this kind of futuristic artwork with that historical context. The essence of Biomod is really about bringing together living life and recycled computer technology. So what we basically do is we collect e-waste, old computers, and then with communities, we start disassembling everything we find, and we build functioning computer units with that waste, basically showing people the inner workings of computers, and also showing them that even though you think something is broken, maybe with a little bit of tweaking, you can fix it and you can build your own units. And then we assemble those computer units into functioning networks, kind of a sculptural kind of network. And then crucially, we use the waste heat of the electronics to grow and develop plants, basically creating kind of small microclimates. That's usually the first step in the project, trying to connect the world of computers with the world of living plants. We also try to find other kind of relationships, or build other kind of relationships between life and computers, and then we use sensors and robotics to build multiple ways of communication between those two worlds. What you can see, for example, on the left image here, there are adjusted sensors that are normally used in medicine, and they're used to pick up weak signals on the leaves of this plant. There's been many different iterations of the project. This was a version that was built in New York City several years ago, 10 years ago. And in this one, for example, we started growing edible plants. So it became like a kind of farming system, and we could really harvest what we were growing inside of our structure. Here's an example of some of the robotics on the left-hand side that we developed also in that same version in New York. It's basically another e-waste component. It was a toy car that was thrown out, and then we hacked it, connected it to an Arduino board, and then through that Arduino board we could connect the car with the computer network. And the car was put on rails above plants, and the computer network could actually position the car above a particular plant and could then squeeze a wet sponge above that plant. So you could really see how the computer network, in a kind of clumsy mechanical way was trying to take care of the plant. See, these are all the kind of connections we're trying to build. On the right-hand side, those two images show that the network is actually used by visitors. There's a multiplayer computer game. It's not a regular game. It's not a commercial game. It's usually something that we built ourselves or something that is existing that is being modified and hacked. And within that game, you have that interaction between people, the plants, robotics, sensors, all brought together in a particular configuration that depends on the goal of the game. So that's really kind of what the project is about. As you can see, there are multiple layers here. It's essentially bringing together social, technological, and ecological systems, but without a particular blueprint. There is the basic concept, and then we invite a community to come up with their interpretation of how it could be shaped. And at this point, there's been more than 30 versions that have been developed over the world. So that co-creation aspect is really key to what we do with seeds and to my personal work. And it really harks back to my deep interest, my personal deep interest in emergence, how things emerge out of rules. Just a few basic rules in the case, the example of Biomod. There's not so many rules on what should be done, but there is a few conceptual lines of thought that we embrace, like recycling e-waste, connecting nature and computer technology, a gaming component, and that's about it. And then those are the guidelines, and then out of that, of course, within a local context with local skills and local materials, then the form is being is found during the project day after day. What we also try to avoid is to, at the beginning of the project, to make a drawing or a blueprint and then just develop the blueprint. We really prefer a much more organic, gradual approach of adding and removing elements until we found a shape that we're happy about. Now, this was also done in New Zealand. It was a smaller version. Also more than 10 years ago in New Plymouth and Waitara, and there I actually worked with local artists, Joe Tito, and we built our kind of own version of a Biomod installation. She's an indigenous artist, and then she used her own painting on pebbles and rocks, and we build a kind of cooling tower, because one of the components in Biomod is that we also use living algae often to cool computer components, which is a bit of an unexpected combination, of course. To use water cooling is a common way of cooling computer components, because it's a very quiet and efficient way of cooling, but using living microalgae, of course, is quite unusual, and we've been doing that a lot in many installations. And here we build a kind of cooling tower for the algae with her work, and then kind of connected everything. Now, this is really, like I said, this is part of the portfolio of Seeds, the collective that I co-founded with a couple of other people. Seeds is the acronym for Space Ecologies, Art and Design, and there's a few, how to put it, characteristics for the kind of work that we do. First of all, it's very future oriented. We're very interested in reflecting on the future. Also, really from a hands-on perspective, as I showed in the Biomod project, really hands-on, trying to prototype ideas, but also from a more theoretical perspective, really questioning the paradigms that we hold sometimes subconsciously on how the future will look like, and then trying to question those paradigms and trying to decolonize our imagination. I think that that's really what we're very interested in. We are explicitly transdisciplinary across a very broad range of different fields, both within the sciences, ranging from biology, astrophysics, neuroscience. We've got all that covered, bioinformatics, to different types of artistic media, which is installation art, video art, interactive art, etc. It really depends from project to project which kind of disciplines are being brought together. We are an open community. Anybody who's interested to get to know us better is welcome. We have monthly gatherings, for example, like an open house. Maggie participated in the last one. If you're interested to join one of those, you can always let me know, and you're more than welcome to join. Now, this leads me to the next chapter in my life. I was convinced this was going to be the rest of my career. I was going to be an artist, a full-time artist, up to the moment where the European Space Agency contacted me and invited me to work with them. That was really based on the kind of futuristic art installations that I was building. Biomod is just one of them. I was doing different things. And it was a particular research group within European Space Agency that I got in touch with. And they're called Melissa. And the Melissa concept, or the Melissa program, is trying to develop a bioregenerative life support system. That is a life support system that basically captures all the waste that comes out of a human body, everything ranging from toilet waste, urine, CO2, sweat, and then gradually decomposes those compounds into useful biomolecules again for plants that provide oxygen and food for the astronauts. It's a fully vegan system at this point. There is no animal protein yet in this system. Could be added by adding insects, for example, but at this point the concept is fully vegan. And the idea is really that those waste materials are being broken down through a sequence of 3 different bioreactors with particular microorganisms that break down those molecules, and then in the end turn them into nitrates and CO2 for plants and edible microalgae. I was immediately hooked on the concept. I loved it. I was able to go back to my scientific background, but I also felt a kind of cultural significance of this beyond the pure engineering aspect, the space engineering aspect. So I started working with this group of people, first actually as an artist. I created a number of art installations that were inspired by this project, and even incorporating some of the technology of this project. But then it basically brought me back into science. And now I have a career path which combines a number of tracks. I'm a scientist, practicing scientist. I'm an artist. I'm also a public speaker, and everything is connected. So that works much better. It was a bit of a struggle, I must say, when I was an artist, trying to figure out how to relate myself to my past. And at the beginning, I was a bit forced taking that distance from science, because I really felt like this was like a handicap. I was like, this was more like impeding my development as an artist, to have that rational analytical background, up to the moment that I discovered that instead of trying to push away some of your strengths or characteristics, it's much better to embrace everything that you have and use that to find your position in the world. And that took me a number of years to figure that out, but that's quite some time ago. So anyhow, I rebooted my scientific career, but this time not just as a biologist, but rather as a space scientist. And this is one of the things that I did. I'm not going to go in too much detail because I want to keep it compact here. But I did participate, for example, in one of the Mars simulation missions that was set up by NASA over the past few years. I participated in the High Seas mission, which is a Mars simulation in Hawaii. There were a number of missions about 6 missions that were funded by NASA, and it was basically situated on the Mauna Loa volcano, remote from almost any sign of civilization, in a dark lava kind of landscape that the geology looks very similar to Mars. And the goal of the High Seas program is mainly to investigate the effects of long-term isolation on group dynamics and on the individual psychology, and also to see if there is something like a recipe to compile a crew for long-term space exploration. Is there like a combination of personalities that you can put together that really creates the ideal resilient crew, or are there particular types that you should absolutely not put together? I mean, we all have our own thoughts about which types of people work well together in confined situations. I think Corona definitely gave everybody a bit of a taste of what it means to be isolated in a small space for longer periods of time. So that's really the goal here of this program. And I participated in the very first mission. I was selected to be part of a 6-person crew. I lived together with 4 Americans and 1 Canadian, and I was assigned as the crew commander of the entire mission. The reason I was assigned as a commander was based on my work in the arts. as basically as a co-lead of all these co-creation efforts like Biomod. So you can see this interesting back and forth, which was completely unplanned. Of course, I never planned like, oh, I'm going to do some community work so I can become a commander for a NASA mission or something. That's not how it works, of course. But this back and forth between art and science is pretty much a constant. The images you can see here is just showing and giving you an impression of daily life in the HAB. There's all kinds of research that was being done that is like an analog for actual research that would be done on Mars: robotics, microbiology research, physical exercise. We were allowed to go outside, but only in a spacesuit. It's not a real spacesuit, it's a spacesuit simulator, just to try and give you that impression of being out there. Now, like I said, this was the start for me of a new track in science, and I basically pushed my interests further, and I got really interested in interstellar exploration. That was something that always piqued my interest, but now I was like, I want to dive a bit deeper into this as a scientist. And I'm talking about human interstellar exploration, traveling to the nearest stars. We're not talking about traveling to distant galaxies like the spectacular images we've just seen over the past couple of days because of the James Webb Telescope having sent these first images. But I'm talking about stars that are in the vicinity of our own star. I mean, vicinity in cosmic terms, of course, a couple of light years. Technically, we don't need to find any new laws of physics to get there. You know, we could do it. And I got really interested in that. But one of the core challenges of crossing these vast distances is uncertainty. In contrast to planning a trip to the moon, which you can really gradually develop, you can build a program where each spaceship or each mission is going closer and closer to the moon, but at a certain point is returning to Earth. Then lessons learned are integrated into the system, and then the spacecraft can go a little further, and then gradually you make it to the moon. It was Apollo 11 that finally touched down on the moon. This approach, this gradual approach, is not really useful for anything interstellar. You're not going to go somewhat interstellar and then go all the way back to Earth to fix a few things and then go back. That would take you centuries to get anywhere. So how does, and this is I think this is where it becomes interesting on a meta level, and definitely today. How do you design systems, solutions for futures with this high uncertainty? For an engineer, I'm working at Delft University of Technology, which is strictly an engineering university, thousands of engineers. This is not so simple. You know, they want specific requirements, and then according to that, they'll make a blueprint and build something. And that's where my biology background came in again. And I decided, let's focus on developing a concept for a growing and evolving spacecraft, a spacecraft that is actually much more dynamic and as such resilient to handle these uncertain futures. Once again, from a metaphorical perspective, I think this is, of course, interesting and applicable to much more than just spacecraft, but this is my case study. As many of my work, I always do this with a group of people with different backgrounds. So this is just to give you an idea of the type of people that I worked with over the past couple of years, people ranging from computer simulation to architecture, etc. And now briefly, because I realize that I'm already talking for quite a bit, so I'm going to start wrapping up. Briefly, the concept is really combining some existing technologies in development, which is asteroid mining and 3D manufacturing in space. The idea is that asteroids do contain a large range of different types of asteroids, but asteroids do contain a lot of interesting building materials. And then 3D manufacturing in space will allow us to build in space instead of building on Earth and having to ship it out there. And so the idea is to transform an asteroid into a hybrid structure and basically hollow out an asteroid, use the materials, the mine's materials to 3D print an architecture, a growing architecture, both inside and outside of the asteroid, and then redirect the structure and then use it as an almost organic spacecraft. This idea of transforming asteroids is nothing new. This comes out of science fiction. There are quite a number of examples from literature and gaming culture in which this idea is explored and visualized. But what we do with our team is we turn it into science. We build a computer model, or we're building a number of computer models in which we can explore the behavior of such a concept. And with that, we basically enter the domain, a relatively new domain of morphogenetic engineering, which is a different way of building things. It's inspired by nature. And the easiest way to explain this is to use the example of termites. Termites build termite mounds. Termite mounds are like the cooling towers on top of their underground fungi farm. Termites are first and foremost farmers, and that's where the colony is. Some people think that the actual mound that you can see, that's the colony. That's just the cooling tower, basically. And the challenge for termites is basically how to bring in fresh air while keeping out the hot air. And through evolution, they figured it out. And there's a particular morphology of the different channels, particular orientation. So they kind of figured out a smart solution for this this challenge. Now the thing is, and this is what I wanted to say here, is that when termites decide to build a new colony, you do not have a master plan. There's not one main termite that runs around with a blueprint telling all the other termites what they need to do. It's interesting that this solution emerges out of the behavior of the termites. So the termites have particular properties and particular rules through which they interact with each other and with the environment. And out of that combination of their properties and the rules they use to engage with each other and with the environment arises that solution, which is very fascinating, of course. And that's something that is now being applied in engineering, working with swarm robotics and then tweaking the robots instead of tweaking the solution, and then the robots create the kind of solution for you. And we, with our system, with our spacecraft concept, we're doing basically the same. And then to conclude the last project with seeds, because, you know, like I said, things are going back and forth between art and science. My work in space actually led me to make art in space. With seeds, we have a project in space, our first actual space art project. It was basically started based on an invitation by Professor Karin van Donink, who's a Belgian professor specialized in rotifers. And you should see them moving here. Rotifers are microscopic aquatic animals. They're the smallest animals on the planet. They consist of only 1,000 cells, which is very little. But even with those 1,000 cells, they create a very sophisticated body with all different kind of organs. They're filter feeders. And the interesting thing is that the species that this professor is working on is female only. There is no more males. So evolution basically weeded out the males, and the females are simply cloning themselves. You know, there's no more need. Why have the hassle of having men around if you can just, if you're perfect yourself and you can copy yourself endlessly, right? There's a lot of jokes, of course, with this organisms and it being extremely feminist in a way. But well, it's called an evolutionary scandal. I guess it's mostly the male researchers that call it an evolutionary scandal. But there is a particular really interesting aspect about this organism. And just like tardigrades, which you might have heard about, when this organism is encountering adverse environmental conditions, it'll turn into a spore that is extremely resilient. And the interesting thing is that when that spore is created, the DNA of that organism just falls apart. And then as soon as you give it a drop of water, it pops back to life and it repairs its DNA. It just stitches together its broken DNA again. That DNA repair aspect is really interesting, and it's also interesting for outer space. And so the idea is basically we created an artwork inspired by these particular properties of that organism, once again with a team with different people with different backgrounds. And now the challenge was that when the professor invited us to create an artwork, they were already planning to send a first experiment with these organisms to space to see if they could still repair their DNA in space. But we couldn't add like a sculpture or a little photo or something. I mean, these space experiments are very constrained in what you can add. And even if you want to add something, it needs to go through a long process of checks before you can do that. So there was not much time. There was actually no possibility. And so European Space Agency told us, like, listen, there are 10 labels on the 10 bags with organisms, and there's a little bit of white space left to the QR code. That's your artistic canvas. And we developed an entire art project based on those 10 square centimeters. I'm running out of time, so I won't have a lot of time to go into the details here, but we created a kind of, we started with putting a unique graphic identifier based on my fingerprint on each of these labels, mirroring the idea of cloning my fingerprint, but then actually failing at it because every fingerprint was slightly different. And those 10 unique identifiers became the basis of a much more expansive artwork. Here are some of the, it's actually what you can see here is the science experiment that contains our artwork in the International Space Station being handled by astronauts. And so the idea was basically that our artwork would go to space. And then when it came back down to Earth, we would use the data from the organisms, the genetic data of the organisms, to transform the artwork. And at this time, we've already sent it twice to space. So the artwork is really being developed in this journey between Earth and space. And what's more, we actually transformed that visual code that I created, that very simple visual code that I created, we transformed it into a sculpture using algorithms. We created a particular algorithm that transforms the visual code into a sculptural shape. And so the sculpture is really an artwork, and the visual code is an artwork that is truly created, co-created by rotifers, by humans, by algorithms and outer space. It's really those creative forces that together shape that artwork. So it's interesting to position that sculpture within an art context and realize that humans are just one of the creative agents that actually generated that artwork. I think that's really what we were interested in to expand our notion of co-creation. So that's where I'm gonna stop my
thank you, Angelo. Wow,
my story ends for
so
today.
inspiring.
I mean, my introduction.
Thank you, so inspiring. Thank you very, very much. If I can get you to unscreen share for a moment, I'll put it back on gallery view. And well, first of all, on behalf of everybody, thank you. That was deeply inspiring, and I think relates to many different things. We have limited time, and I'm very mindful of your valuable time. So we do want to be very, mindful. So let's, I'm thinking rather than hit the questions that I had originally thought about to do with transdisciplinary practice, let's at least start with one of the PlantLab people and get you to hear a little bit about who they are and what they're doing, so it becomes more of a dialogue. Vivian and Alan, do you want to maybe make a start on that? If I can get you to unmute.
I've unmuted. Goedemorgen.
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 We are based in New Zealand, but we're currently visiting family in England, and we're obviously part of the PlantLab collaboration. Shall I just quickly talk about myself first? I can totally relate to what you were saying about being a scientist and an artist, because my background is as a biomedical scientist, and I've come to arts in the last 10 years or so. I've always done it, but always been much more interested in more recently. And my interest is really in the difference between what might be the nature of some ultimate reality and the equipment that humans have got to actually perceive that. So the fact that we create a world, it's based on the work by people like Anil Seth, Donald Hoffman, and so forth. But that's a quick description of my interest. But a question for you about the whole exploration of space, I suppose, is the question of gravity being something that is essential to everything we do here. It's something we just take for granted. In space, it's a totally different beast. And some of the latest evidence suggests that it affects people long-term really quite negatively. So how does one address these sorts of problems in terms of sending people up there and the long-term exposure to a totally different kind of experience of reality?
I mean, there are two questions, two answers to this, I guess. we can either try to embrace zero gravity, which we'll have to do anyhow, and we can create our own gravity in space. I think that's really the answer here. Embracing zero gravity will require some adaptation of humans on a much deeper level than just doing physical exercise. I think there might be even some, in the long run, some genetic adaptations needed. I wouldn't mind, to get some augmentation so I can withstand zero gravity a little better. Gene therapy or genetic modification will, in the long run, will probably be part of space exploration, I would assume. I know morally and ethically this is a difficult subject, but at a certain point, this will have to be discussed. It's interesting, for example, that resistance to space radiation, the other main challenge in deep space, is actually genetically, there is some genetic predisposition to that. So some astronauts are genetically better able to cope again with space radiation than others. So that's where it already starts. Now, it's also interesting when you would embrace zero gravity, how in the long term it would affect the outlook of your body, of course, and how your body would maybe get a slightly different shape. And also how to conceive of architecture in zero gravity is something, of course, we've been doing for decades now. But it's interesting what happens there is, on one hand, it allows for a radical rethink of architecture, right? Because suddenly there's no more floor and ceiling, everything is floor and ceiling. At the same time, for example, in the International Space Station, they didn't want to install they basically didn't install a table because it was like, what's the point of a table? Table is a gravity thing. And the astronauts protested. And they were like, we want a table. We need a table. We need something. So you see, there is still these very innate things that are really difficult, even if you would embrace that new culture, that it would be difficult to throw out. On the other hand, I think there is, and this is what I'm also what I'm advocating is that we have a bit of a blind spot at this point when it comes to the design of our spacecraft. There is no artificial gravity being explored in outer space right now in our aerospace designs, which is like, look at all the even the concepts from the 50s and movies like 2001: A Space Odyssey, these ideas of artificial gravity. Why not? We will really need this, and this solves a lot of problems, and there is a beauty to it as well, to create that spinning world. And it doesn't mean that the entire spaceship has to spin, it just could be a part of it could be spinning. That could probably also resolve a lot. So I'm really looking forward to the first artificial gravity aerospace engineering. But at this point, there's not so much on the horizon. It's really something that keeps falling off the bandwagon over and over again.
Angelo, when you're doing your sort of biological plant experiments in the space context, do you need to account for gravity when you're actually creating those experiments, because plants grow differently or they behave quite differently than they do here? Or
Yeah. In the beginning, it was thought that plants didn't grow very well in space because of the lack of gravity, because that's how roots work. They have these little particles that really give the root an indication of where to grow and how gravity is oriented. Now, actually, what happened was that the growing conditions and the lighting conditions in those early experiments were not optimal, and that's why the plants didn't grow very well. And what really happens with plants is when there is no gravity, they will use other environmental cues to orient themselves. So it's not like they can't grow. In the beginning, people were like, oh, probably they won't, their roots will grow all over the place and they'll get deformed, basically. That's not the case. Plants can perfectly grow well in zero gravity, and they will use things like the light and humidity and nutrient gradients to create a sense of orientation. So they'll just use different kind of environmental cues. So it's perfectly fine. It's perfectly possible. One of the main challenges is really how to provide water to the plants because of zero gravity. If you're not using a centrifuge in which you create artificial gravity. So in zero gravity, or microgravity, how to provide the water. And it's not just about the water flying off, it's really the surface tension that creates these bubbles, and then they don't really penetrate. So there's, of course, there's been quite a lot of research on how to mitigate this using wicks, for example, and all kinds of different complicated and less complicated systems. At this point, it is possible to grow plants. There's a little bit of misunderstanding. There's always this image, I just saw it a couple of days ago on Reddit, that zinnia is this flower, was the first flower that was grown in space. So it was a NASA experiment, and which is not true. It's actually the Russians that started working with biology in space very, very early on. And they grew the first flowers in space, I think in the late 70s or early 80s. So there's a whole tradition to growing plants in space. The only thing we haven't done yet, and this relates to my work, is there's been quite a bit of space biology research investigating a handful of plants. But we need to move to a different scale. If we really want to start bringing ecology into deep space to make a more sustainable space exploration, we'll need to start growing calories in space. And just growing 2 heads of lettuce, you're not going to feed astronauts with that. It looks charming and it's good for PR, the astronauts eating some of the leaves of the lettuce, but we need to start growing full-scale, large-scale crops. And that's something, yeah, that at this point, there are several prototypes and ideas, but we're nowhere near close to do that. So that's another thing that I would advocate for, is to start doing that. The interesting thing is that the challenge of space really requires you to be so extremely resourceful and to rethink all the assumptions that you have that you take from Earth, that when you're developing these systems, of course, they can be applied back on Earth. And if you can grow crops in space, you can grow crops anywhere on Earth.
Right.
Because Earth is still much more hospitable than any place in space.
Wow, interesting. Thank you. Tracy, I think you had a question. If you want to do a very quick line as to who you are and ask, if that would be great.
Yeah, so my original first foray into university was in sciences and biology and linguistics, and then life happened and I didn't finish that, and then life happened again and I became an artist. So I understand that you don't plan these things. So yeah, my art focus is sculpture and interactive and experiential as a main thing. I do some other bits and pieces as well. And one of the ideas I've been having for the work we're doing with PlantLab, it could be quite an experiential work, trying to simulate if you were in the plankton swirls in the ocean, the swirls that we can see from space photographs. What would that experience be like? And the more I got thinking about it, it's like there's a lot of metaphors for actually how we actually are in our lives in the world in terms of how much control we have and how much control we think we have. And so, question. One is like trying to aim your experiments or your artwork towards an audience that will already understand, that already has a lot of that same background so that they can relate, versus aiming more towards people that this might be a new idea for, because I'd like to be able to spread that new idea, but if it's not going to even land. So it's just that, like you don't want to preach to the choir, but you don't want to just miss your audience altogether. So, and my B question, which is kind of related, comes to funding. And, as an artist or as a scientist, like, where do you apply for your funding for your projects? Because again, the audience makes a difference on how you package what you're doing. So that's it's 2 questions. But
thank you, Tracy.
They were related.
Yeah.
And it relates to transdisciplinary, one of the challenges of transdisciplinary practice anyway, which is kind of in the general realm. Angelo, what are your responses to that? Get everyone else, please. Cool.
Yeah, the first question, how do you want your art to communicate with the audience is a challenge in these layered artworks. Let's put it this way. I mean, of course, I'm talking about transdisciplinary, but they're layered, not just because of the combination of different disciplines, but often because of the different messages that are simultaneously living inside that artwork, especially if you co-create them with a lot of people. Different ideas might start to live in that same artwork. And personally, I love complexity. Some artists are more minimalists, want to go to something very, stripped down, which I totally dig. But it's not what I do or what we do usually. So that brings indeed the problem of communication. Our works work really well when we are with our works. When we are in the room engaging with an audience, that's where the sparks happen, you know. That's just, then the work becomes a conversation piece, and it just, but the problem is when we go home and the work lives on its own in a gallery space or a museum space, and it's a challenge. I don't think we've ever had the perfect setup yet. For example, in Biomod, part of the strength of the Biomod project is really being part of that community and going through that process. That's, I think, those people that participated and co-created the work, they will have experienced the artwork the deepest. A spectator that comes in after it was created, yeah, they miss out on that social dynamic. They might not even realize there was a whole social component to it, you know, because they see the technology and the plants and they're all mesmerized by, my God, how does this all connected? And then also in Biomod, it's, when you look at Biomod, it looks extremely complex. It's actually pretty straightforward if you know a little bit about, you know, about computing and how to grow plants. But the first impression might be like, my God, this is just so complicated. Personally, for my stance is you don't need to understand all these different aspects to sense something poetic and conceptually interesting emanating from the work. And I'm not bothered if you're, you know, there's a layer you're missing out. It's fine, you know, as long as you're intrigued and you know, and hopefully a couple of weeks later you still have that image in your mind of that installation and what happened there. So that's one thing. So I've kind of started embracing the fact that it's kind of impossible to communicate all of that. Now with Engines of Eternity, it's a slightly different challenge because there is a lot of because I talked about it very briefly and very simply, and it's way more complicated than I presented, because the data that we're actually using to evolve the artwork, that's a thing in itself. It's so much data that we had to physically go to the university to pick up the physical hard drives because it was just not possible to send them over the internet. And then we have a bioinformatician in Seeds that actually digged into those data and then explore the data and reorganize them using databases and artificial intelligence. And there's a whole story behind it. But then again, do people need to know all this before they can appreciate the work? Well, maybe not. Maybe for people that keep on asking questions and they discover the depth of the work. But once again, I'm talking about us being there and explaining it. And when we're not there, yeah, it's true. There might be some of that missing. My hope is always that because it is generally conceived from such a deep perspective, that people, and this is a bit esoteric, but I think art needs to be esoteric to be strong, to be powerful. I do have this belief that when there is this depth in the work that is somehow consistent, because of course you can totally mess it up, but there is a sort of consistent depth in the work that people sense it. And the work just emanates that. That's really my belief. And that's how I try to develop that. Now, in the work, and then I'm gonna conclude, but in Engines of Eternity, for example, the component that I didn't talk about because of time constraints is that, yes, we created this physical artwork that evolves because of its journey through space, like real journey through space. But we added a second component to the installation, which is a video essay. And the video essay is really talking about the future of mankind in space. And it's really it uses that ideal situation of the Rotifers as the perfected organism that is just making copies of itself and repairing its DNA. It doesn't need any more change. That's how it looks like superficially, right? Like a perfect solution to creating an organism. But in fact, what this professor discovered is there is still a lot of evolution going on if you zoom deeper into the biochemistry of the organism and into the DNA mechanics. And we use that as a metaphor on how we view our future in space, like a perfected world, which nowadays with all the culture wars raging is very present. What kind of perfected world is representative and should we embrace? Or should we try to embrace that a perfect culture is an illusion and the essence is permanent flux? And how on earth do we combine the need for identity with the essence of flux? that is just such a difficult thing for humans to do. So, and that's explored in a video essay. And I must say that video essay became the centerpiece of the work for people experiencing the work. So that it's a discussion that is basically touching so many people. Almost everybody feels connected to the discussion. And then through that, that becomes a portal through which you bring them into some of the more technical and scientific things if they want to. So I hope this kind of helps you to answer.
No, it's helpful. And I guess the follow-up question kind of is very quickly is to do with one of the challenges of transdisciplinary practice is one of the challenges is funding, because often transdisciplinary practice sits outside funding, or some of the things you're doing don't meet the criteria or prohibit it from being funded by certain agencies or art things. Mm-hmm. Or perhaps undermines the credibility in certain other areas where it might be funded. So very briefly, how have you found that process when talking to others and also in your experience? What are the ways that you can overcome those challenges around that sort of transdisciplinary, multi-layered practice?
Yeah, there's the typical way of funding things like this is by segmenting things. And then within the broader projects, zooming in on a particular thing that is a bit more understandable for the outside world and finding some funding for that, and then using some of the funding to bring in some of the other people. I mean, that's the classic way. You basically tell the funders what they need, what they want. And you will, it's not like you're not lying. That's actually what you're going to provide, but it's just a part of the bigger project. And so it's really more like there is not the one single funding that will just fund the overall project usually, unless, like in Engines of Eternity, we frame it as an artwork, and then suddenly there's this huge element of freedom that comes in. So it's really, if the funding is a bit more academically oriented or innovation oriented or something like this, a bit more specific, well, then you'll have to focus on one particular component of your project and develop that. And hopefully you can combine a few of that. But I think generally in the arts, that gives you a lot of freedom. Like, for example, we got funding to develop Engines of Eternity with 2 grants. And they were just, basically the core message was, we want to develop an artwork in space that reflects on our future. And, that's broad enough. And then you can do all these different crazy things. And then, it's good. And actually, one of the funding bodies was a government funding, and they want to use this as an example in one of their guides they're developing on how to apply and funding as a good practice example. So, which we're like, okay, thank you for that. So I think that. On the other hand, my current research on interstellar exploration is actually self-funded. It's a bit of an unusual situation, which I'm not sure I would recommend everybody to do. But the thing is that I'm actually working, my income comes mainly from my talks and my speeches. Like I said, I'm a professional speaker. And then I have a position at university as an external PhD researcher, which means that I get all the facilities, but there is no fixed funding. If I want to find funding, they will help me. But what I decided is not to find funding. Like, no, I don't want funding. Because how on earth would I otherwise be able to develop in a scientifically sound way the concept of starships in the university? I mean, that sounds like I would have to squeeze my research into something much more pragmatic, and it would become a more regular spaceship, which I totally was not interested in. And so that allowed me to academically go really out of any traditional confines and really develop this. And now we have a body of work. We have 3 computer models that we developed, and there's a lot of volunteering and enthusiasm in the team. And now I have a foundation through which I probably can apply for actual funding because it's a bit more concrete. But the initial stages, I wanted to do it in full freedom, and I just brought in the money through other means.
Wow, fantastic. Now, I'm conscious of time, and Angelo, you are valuable, your time is valuable. What I'd like to do is maybe the 3 people who haven't spoken, can I just get you to at least briefly introduce yourselves to Angelo, just so, I think just in terms of relationship, it's nice, Angelo, for you to know who our team is here in case there's opportunities in the future. So very briefly, Kim, can you just quickly say who you are, just a little bit about you, and what maybe something you like about the talk or connected to it, very briefly.
Just before you start, Kim. So Maggie, how much time do you have planned left? Because
I was just what time do you have, Angelo? Because I'm just conscious
I
of.
I easily have 15 more minutes or so.
Okay.
It's not. I'm not under huge time pressure.
Okay, that's very generous.
That's not a problem.
Yeah. Well, Kim, then you're on the spot. What? Say who you are, and maybe if not a question, then something you connected to in Angelo's talk.
Yep. So yeah, I'm Kim. I call myself a creative technologist, mainly because I love playing with technology and art all at the same time. And I mean, one of the things I've really connected with is maybe one of the approaches of just emergence, or just allowing things, especially in the biomod stuff, of forming and kind of setting up systems, and just seeing what happens within your expertise. Yeah, around that. I mean, I guess from your talk as well, I was just thinking about you've kind of separated scientists and artists as two separate things. Do you think there's a way that they can exist at exactly the same time and emerge into a new thing or a new discipline?
I don't think there a new discipline
or a new emergence of.
Yeah. It sometimes kind of irks me that the kind of very simplistic narrative about how artists and scientists are the same, and then I'm always like, they're so not the same. And it's actually the fact they're not the same is not a problem. I don't see why they need to be the same. And then people are like, yeah, but they're both creative and the lab is like a studio. And I'm like, yeah, but that's really, come on, that's very superficial. I think they're just both really valuable ways of looking at the world, and connecting them, making them either, if you have those interests yourself, finding ways, like I think many of us here try to do, finding ways to connect them without necessarily feeling the need to transform that into a new discipline is for me perfectly fine. So I think, but finding those ways to connect them, of course, is key here. And when I talk about diversity, I usually talk about nested diversity. And so you have this internal diversity where you have these multiple interests. When you manage to bring them together, that gives you that different strength to be in the world and to engage with the world. Then there's, of course, the diversity within disciplines between people in a team. And then there's the global diversity. And I'm really interested to max out that diversity and to see how they can work together. I'm not sure if that answers your question. It's just how I look at this relationship between art and science.
Wow, cool. And Fiona.
Kia ora, and thank you so much for your generous time and your authenticity. It's been really, really inspirational. So my background, I started out in agricultural science and sort of plant pathology, and then agronomy, and then natural resource management, and kind of moved in different worlds, and my art practice at the moment is a real mixture of things, but I'm having a foray into clay, loving it, and the structural stuff. I think something around COVID just made me want to get my hands into something more solid. So I'm also I do quite a lot of research. Well, what I've been doing a lot of research in is around water, actually, and how that influences everything, and the quality of the water being the thing, not the things that are actually floating in the water. So that's really fascinated me, and so some of the things I want to do with PlantLab to do with water and how that is in a plant, for example. Fascinated me when you were talking about the interface between well, in a zero gravity. It's like, yeah, of course, I never even thought of that. How does that happen? But then it had me go, okay, well, this is microbes. We've got root zones, and we've got all that interaction between microbes that actually assist water to get into a plant. So, and so anyway, that's what my immediate thought was, that that's a really, really important aspect of it. So you can't leave them out. I'm super interested in regenerative agriculture at this point, and how we can, and so that plays out really when I'm looking at things that just aren't tidy, and I love it because actually in their untidiness it's perfect. And I'll just look at our food forest as opposed to our neighbour who loves to actually mow their lawn, and it's this great contrast. I love it. Anyway, raving a little, but I did have a question for you about water and using water as a medium in artwork. Are there any pitfalls or things that I need to be looking out for? Just like some words of wisdom around using water in the space in an artwork, in your experience.
Well, there's the obvious risks, of course. I'm always a little concerned in Biomod. We're mixing electricity with water, and it makes me uneasy sometimes. I'm not going to lie, especially with the water cooling and everything. But yeah, but one of the things that I noticed is that, for example, one of my early works was creating bio paintings. It was basically living paintings using algae growing on canvases, and then spraying the water in particular ways, and then these patterns would evolve, and you would create a breathing painting. That's like my first bio art pieces. And one time I had created this kind of setup with a big frame and a big board and a spraying system. And we used, how do you call it again? The Plasterboard, I think. And I was like interested if we could grow some algae on Plasterboard. It was once again an experiment, kind of, let's see what happens in the gallery. And the interesting thing is the spraying was done with a timer and everything. And the algae didn't grow on the surface it just stayed pristine. And then later on, I kind of discovered why. It had to do with pH levels and everything. But on the backside of the plasterboard, there was this beautiful pattern of fungi growing with all kinds of colors. So I was like, wow, that's like interesting. You're trying to create an artwork where you show something, and actually you have to go to the backside of the artwork to see what is really interesting. And then, because I inoculated the plasterboard with algae, hoping there would be some sort of pattern emerging, because the splash of the water on the floor of the gallery, there was this whole kind of pool of green algae on the floor of the gallery that dripped down to the floor below. So that was a bit of a risky business there. I didn't cause any major damage, but what Kim also talked about, this idea of emergence. You set something up and then you stand back and you see what happens. That was an interesting example of that. But other than that, yeah, I think, anything with water in galleries and museums, you can imagine yourself the risks with that. What I'm a little concerned about is that, for example, in America, it is more difficult to bring in life in museums because they have all these liability issues, and then it becomes a little frustrating. Yeah.
It's my liability insurance and PlantLab, everybody. So we'll have that conversation at some point.
Okay. Yeah.
Jade, do you want to introduce yourself and have a question?
And then I think Vivian also wants to.
Yes, and Vivian as well. Vivian, I'll do you after Jade. If that's right. I have seen that. Yeah.
Hello, I'm Jade, and I'm a digital media artist and an educator. And at the moment, I have a particular interest in organic and natural products for your skin. So combining the two disciplines there, which has a kind of naturally grown, excuse the pun, Yeah, everything you've been talking about has been absolutely fascinating. I was particularly interested in the plants growing in space, and I'm glad that Maggie asked those questions because it's something I was interested in. So thank you so much for coming and talking to us tonight.
Thank you.
You're most welcome.
Vivian.
Hi, Angelo. No,
Angelo.
No. Vivian, I'm a poet and a collaborator with this husband of mine and with lots of other people. I love what you're talking about with simulation, metaphor, faking it till you make it on the borders of a volcano, which I suspect when they go into space, that guy lied so bad. Space is nothing like being on the side of a volcano, fantastic to be at that place. So here's a really specific question, very silly. That article that you did for New Scientist, which was about menu fatigue. I love that phrase. That's so cool. Was you said we were fine, we worked out just great, but I was like, but what was the solution? What was the kind of top thing?
So for those, just to explain a bit, one of the main scientific studies we did during the NASA mission was to find ways to tackle menu fatigue. Menu fatigue, as we know, is you eat the same food over and over again, especially pre-prepared meals, and you get sick and tired of it. And psychologically, you think you're not hungry, but actually your body needs the food, but you just can't stomach it anymore. It's a problem in the military, for example, and I think we've all experienced it. Maybe even being out of our comfort zone and having a different type of food that you don't really connect with. It's interesting. I love the idea of comfort food, which is the food that you grow up with, usually relatively simple, and you can eat it endlessly. For me, it's bread and cheese. I'm such a European. But then my friends in our Seeds friends in the Philippines, it's a particular rice with some adobo, and then they can eat that endlessly every single day without ever getting sick and tired of it. But in any case, in space, it's a challenge. And so we were asked if we were guinea pigs, and they were asking us to cook. What would happen if astronauts could cook? And not just eat those pre-prepared meals. So we had 2 days of pre-prepared meals and then 2 days where we were allowed to improvise with a whole set of ingredients with just the right amount of calories for that 4 months of isolation, so 120-day isolation. And that suddenly brings in creativity and agency and sharing and caring for each other. We're like, listen, I made this for all of you, and then that gesture, and I hope you will like it. And that kind of, it's just a total game changer. I mean, it seems so simple, but it really had this huge impact also on psychological levels. So just being able, even with the basic ingredients, because everything that we had as ingredient that we had available was shelf stable. There's many traditional things that are shelf stable, like flour and oil and nuts and all that sort of stuff, and dried, but also dehydrated vegetables and freeze-dried meat, freeze-dried vegetables. And some of my colleagues were incredibly creative and really good cooks, coming up with all kinds of beautiful recipes out of that. But the thing is, because it was science, every single scoop that we put on a plate, we had to film it, we had to weigh it, and then we had to fill out a form before we ate it, like evaluating the smell and how we think it would taste, and if it looked appealing. And then after we ate it, we had to fill out another form for every single thing that we ate during those 4 months. So that was a lot of paperwork. We came out, we had breakfast without paperwork. That was like a huge relief, as you can imagine. So,
Angelo, this is so great because metaphor, I'm hearing what you're saying as one massive metaphor. Could we use that as, this is what I'm thinking for with PlantLab and everything. It's like, you might think that this formula, it's almost a blueprint for food, but guess what? Mixing it up, letting people go free, that's the way to go. And
especially if you have these different backgrounds, of course. Like, we were culturally quite an interesting, diverse group. We were all Western, but the Americans were African-American, Puerto Rican, Russian-American. There was also a gay person. We had somebody from Canada, and I was from Belgium. And that created enough different perspectives on all kind of levels of life, and also of just the mundane things in life, to keep it interesting and to bring in that creativity and that
Fantastic.
that variation.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So on that note, the final question for you, Angelo, what do you think is the success? How do you make transdisciplinary practice successful when you're working in a group of people, and what do you see as the future of that?
Facilitation, and I think the leadership is needed, but nothing like traditional leadership. I mean, traditional top-down, more corporate-inspired leadership, where you start, organizing people in different departments and stuff like that. That's totally, of course, not what we want. But I do not believe in really productive and maximizing the power of transdisciplinary research without facilitation. I just don't see it happening. There are exceptions, of course, but just putting together scientists and artists standing back and waiting for the magic to happen, it could, depending on the personalities, but often it's a polite introduction and then things fizzle out again. And it doesn't mean that the leadership has to be one single person. It could be a group of people. It doesn't mean that the leader has to be the same person. You can have rotating leadership. There's all kinds of ways to, to avoid that more typical top-down patriarchal kind of old school style of leadership, but it needs facilitation. And of course, there's a few prerequisites to be able to be a leader, I think, is because this is what I talk about in my talks as well. I think one of those things is you need to have a focus on putting yourself in service of the process. It's not your project, you're part of the project, and remembering that. It's not always easy. I'm not going to say that this is just, when I'm working in Biomod, I have my own I have my own ideas about what Biomod should be like, could be like, and it's sometimes difficult to not impose them. And this brings me to those two main challenges that I think that are important here. The first one is, if you leave a group, a transdisciplinary group, just on their own device and, figure it out, more often than not, it'll fizzle out, or you will lose a lot of people because, there is just not that focus. On the other hand, if the people that are facilitating start imposing too many rules and too many directions and too many blueprints, people are like, yeah, we thought we were going to get a lot of agency, but if at the end of the ride, actually the decisions are all made by some of those people here. So it's not really. So either way, you will lose the agency of people, and finding that sweet spot, that's the daily challenge of the people that are facilitating, and realizing there is no fixed position. One day you really need to be a bit more guiding, because that's what the group just feels, because they feel more lost. And one day the group needs to tell you, Angelo, you're micromanaging, step back. And then I'm like, okay, sorry about this. And then I step back and I let them do. And that's just part of it. And it's like I said, it's never fixed. Every day is different. Secondly, you need to be curious as a leader to learn new languages. I'm not talking about actual languages, that comes in handy. I speak a couple, but it's mostly about wanting to engage with the different domains that you're bringing together and asking people, give me a crash course. I'm never going to be as good as a programmer as you. I'm not a programmer, but just give me a crash course in Python. So I can just, and at least I have some idea what it is. I can communicate it. And then by doing that, you can start building bridges, you can translate, you can start building bridges, and you can just understand everybody a little better. So I think that those two things, in my experience, are really key.
Thank you, Angelo. And thank you so much. We're coming to the end of our time together, but thank you so much for giving your time today, Angelo. We're going to have this playing on a monitor, either as part of the PlantLab installation or as one of the things we're offering people, or during the time of it. And it's really particularly to support artists in Te Tai Tokoro to be inspired to work across disciplines, to think differently, to kind of expand their practice and their mind to all the possibilities that aren't just here, but are elsewhere as well. So I think you've done that very much and encapsulated that. So thank you on behalf of all of us from our hearts. That's the main thing. I think really, really wonderful to have you, and lovely to see you again after many years.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's so interesting. Thank you so much for the invitation.